people talk about breaking the fourth wall, more often than not, they're referring to something like this.
Oh, hello.
Or this.
It's over. Go home.
But you probably don't think of this. Give me a second and I'll explain. The term, the fourth wall, is generally attributed to the French philosopher Denis Diderot, and its original definition comes from a very literal place representing the invisible wall between actors and an audience. But today I'm arguing a more modern definition, that the fourth wall represents any degree of separation between the audience and art. Breaking the fourth wall generally means directly addressing the audience or meta self-awareness, but there are other ways for media to remove that barrier. Emotion in storytelling primarily comes from a place of empathy, connecting and seeing into a character's world. But every so often in stories, audiences aren't experiencing emotion because a character is, they're experiencing something in conjunction with the characters. Take for example this scene from Naruto Shippuden, where Shikamaru is mourning the loss of a close one. When I was watching this, I didn't just empathize with Shikamaru, I was having an experience alongside him. But sometimes stories come along and get rid of the fourth wall in a more subtle way, one you might not notice unless you were paying close attention. This is a running series called Exploring Frieren. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about when the audience stops empathizing and starts experiencing. So the fourth wall is actually a really interesting thing. We can look at historic ways that the fourth wall is broken, like Shakespeare plays where actors were actively talking to the audience. Or on the opposite side of the spectrum, more modern ways, like video games that tell a story. When someone's controlling a character and it influences the story, there's once again a removal of that separation. Or even a level beyond that, to the most extreme. Virtual and augmented reality are already influencing the way some stories are being told. But all stories are built off of a foundation of the history of storytelling before it. There are tons of established rules and systems that most people follow and some subvert to create engaging stories. But all of these rules eventually come down to what I argue is the core purpose of art, to evoke emotion. And emotion in storytelling as a form of art is built primarily around a foundation of empathy. There's a necessary degree of investment in the characters and story. Now, all art takes advantage of the human brain to evoke emotion. But before we get into the psychology of art, let's understand why I'm bringing up any of this in the first place. So obviously I have this running series called Exploring Frieren, and if we include this video, I've released 14 different essays using Frieren as an excuse to talk about things I find interesting. If any of you guys find yourself back after watching one of my previous videos, consider subscribing. I'm gonna keep releasing these weekly. I've loosely been approaching the first season of Frieren chronologically, so for this video, I found myself rewatching episode 9, which has one of my favorite fights from the entire first season. And I noticed something in this episode that I'd never really thought about, which I've since learned can be referred to as mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. Mirrors and windows are a little bit more intuitive. Stories can allow people to reflect back on their own life, or see into someone else's. You can see yourself in some characters and experience completely new perspective in others. But what I'm talking about today is more rooted in that idea of the sliding glass door. In the more traditional sense, I've seen this metaphor used to refer to when people are really engrossed in a story. But in my case, I'm not talking about when you feel an emotion as an extension of just empathy, but specifically being able to empathize and personally experience an emotion alongside a character. I think this episode of Frieren does that in a way I've never seen before. But before we analyze that episode, I want to start first by explaining some of the things I've learned about the psychology of art. Completely independent of individual personality, the human mind is influenced by certain norms and standards. Cultural and biological influences are deeply ingrained from an early age. Some people work hard to break away from these social norms or instinctual responses, but even in breaking away, they're still influencing people, and that's only talking about the standards we're aware of. Take for example music. Taking a look at the demographics of my audience, most of you will be used to 12-tone music. People's first time listening to microtonal music will sound jarring and off-putting. Seriously, look it up. Most of you will hate it. But it's actually this whole world that's super interesting. This is an example of cultural norms. The reason we know this is because there's many other societies all across the world that don't subscribe to the 12-tone technique. Human taste is heavily influenced by what we're used to. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, human beings have deeply ingrained instinctual biological responses. This study, for example, found that light landscapes are significantly more comforting than dark paintings. This is based off of the instinctual response to self-preserve. We're afraid of the dark because we can't see what's in it. While this may seem obvious, there's lots of rules that are less intuitive that also are based in instinctual response. Studies have also found that symmetry is appealing to humans, or that we have a bias towards the left cheek of the face. Seriously, there's compelling scientific evidence that independent of culture, human beings value the left side of the face more. In this selfie study, they found that people even did the reverse in mirrors, where they would value the perceived left side of their face, which was really their right because of the mirror's reflection. As soon as you start noticing it, you'll see it all over the place. Take for example these Marvel posters, where 19 of the characters, 20 if you include the raccoon, are facing with their left cheek forward, whereas only 8 characters are facing with their right cheek forward. A big portion of them are tiny and in the background, or it seems like they're there to create a more balanced image, which by the way is just another rule. The point is to highlight the fact that while light and dark images feels really obvious, there are tons of examples that are less obvious. Lots of rules with lighting a film have nothing to do with creating a natural image and more so to do with creating a compelling one, which ultimately leads to the next point of this video, the 2 different ways people feel emotion in art. The terms I've used when discussing this in the past are body and mind. Take a second to listen to this music. Most likely the emotions you're feeling are not coming from a cerebral place. You don't have to put yourself in someone else's shoes or empathize with a character. This is what I would call embodied feeling. Now, if I were to ask you to think about the most tragic piece of media you've ever consumed, see, that comes from the mind. In reality, there's overlap between these two. They don't exist in a vacuum, and any art can find a way to participate in both or either, and sometimes it can be completely determined by the audience member's interpretation. I think storytelling often uses both the body and mind to evoke emotions. But core to enjoying a story is the ability to step out of your own, to empathize and invest. But sometimes when consuming a story, you stop empathizing and you start experiencing. The most obvious examples of this are built around adrenaline and cortisol, the stress hormone. When people watch scary movies, independent of how aware of the fact that they are in no real risk, the fear they feel often feels very real. The experience of a jump scare is startling, completely independent of empathy. Sometimes those things feel cheap, like they're tricks, but there are other ways in which you can experience a story as well. The death of a character you love can result in very real grief. I'm not saying people can't differentiate between reality and fiction, but it's genuinely sad to lose a character you love. When a story you're really invested in is fighting to save the world, it's easy to feel relief when things work out in the end. There's a deep human instinctual need for connection. It's also something that independently people, me included, just seem to value. So to actively experience an emotion that runs in conjunction with a character you're supposed to be empathizing with, it adds a lot to the experience. These moments are often the byproduct of extreme emotion. The 2 examples I've given so far are the death of a character you loved and the fight to save a world. Those moments take a lot of time to properly set up. The average story generally gets to do that a couple times. There's longer series like One Piece and Naruto that get to do it often, but that's because they have thousands of episodes to work with and tons of downtime between those moments. But it turns out that's not the only way to do it. Sometimes writers make the fourth wall disappear in a subtle way. I'm sure more people have done it, but I really can't come up with another example outside of this episode of Frieren. Not because I don't think it's been done before, but because I think its subtlety gets in the way of its recognition. So let's finally talk about Frieren. There's this thing called the 5 elements of storytelling that I've talked about a couple times. Characters, conflict, plot, setting, and theme. I think you can look at any story and take those 5 elements and put them in order from least to most important. I've argued in the past that Frieren is not a story built around conflict. In some ways, it almost feels like a slice of life, as stakes are sparse and there's very rarely a real threat. And part of the reason for that is the story is built around this long-living elf mage who saved the world. So in a similar vein to stories like One Punch Man, she functions as a safety net. Someone so capable that there never seems to be any substantial real risk. And across the first 9 episodes, the audience is conditioned to rely on that. Now this feeling runs in conjunction with 2 characters in our story, Fern and Stark. They're party members accompanying Frieren. And when the stakes rise and they're forced into a fight that's really dangerous, and Frieren leaves, the audience and the characters have the same experience. Not one built around crazy high emotions, but a discomfort, because we all lost the safety net. Something I love about this is it's not the breaking of the fourth wall, it's making it disappear. It's opening the sliding glass door and enhancing the ability to connect with the story. It's subtle, which means it's probably more common than I realize. And I think it makes this fight scene, which has tons of significance to the story, even better. It's built around these major breakthroughs for two young characters that I was already incredibly invested in. Stark has to face a very real fear in an incredibly clever way, essentially having to fight a shadow of the master that gave him his scar, someone whose strength he's terrified of. Fern has no idea her capability because it's always existed in such a vacuum with such extreme safety. In actually a really interesting way, Frieren is a great teacher. There's this idea in education called the zone of proximal development. The optimal place to grow is outside of your comfort zone, but not so far that you panic or give up. Some people will call this X+1, X being your limit, and then a little bit beyond that. And I think that the way that Frieren teaches Fern and Stark is an excellent example of this. Fern actually explains it to Stark when they first meet. Growth is often the byproduct of consistent effort and then an eventual leap of faith. And part of what makes this scene so effective is the audience has been conditioned to also rely on Frieren. So when she goes off on her own and leaves Fern and Stark to deal with this issue, I found myself having the exact same concerns the characters did, and it enhanced the scene. There are a million things to praise in this series, from the outstanding animation that is used very sparingly, to the writing, characters, world building, and remarkable exploration of trope. It's legitimately changed my mind on one of my least favorite genres, fantasy, because there's all these things that they do that are really subtle that add a lot. Like when they make a scene even better by making the fourth wall disappear.